Welcome to our broadcast tonight. Philanthropist and founder of the world's most successful hedge fund, George Soros, joins us. We'll also have some novel ideas and interesting ideas on revitalizing the inner cities. Hugh Price will be here. He is the new president of the Urban League. We begin with George Soros. He calls himself a statesman without a state, financier and philanthropist. He established his flagship investment vehicle, the Quantum Fund, in 1969 with $4 million. He now has $11 billion under management. Not entirely fulfilled, he devotes some of his energies to building philanthropic empires as well. Having spent over $1 billion, he is the single most influential private citizen in the reconfigured Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Yesterday, he testified before a congressional subcommittee on the responsibilities of the United States in the post-communist era, and we're pleased to have him here. Welcome back. Thank you, George, for coming. Talk to me about how you see what's happening, because there are a lot of people, and I read now from the New York Times, there are a lot of people who are saying we lost lots of opportunities in the Soviet Union with the collapse and in Eastern Europe. This is from June 12, 1994, in a piece on, I think, by the executive director of the Freedom House, saying that today, out of 22 states in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, there are only 5, Albania, Armenia, the Czech Republic, Estonia, and Latvia, in which former communists do not hold power or significantly share in governance.
Well, I entirely agree with that position that we have lost a historic opportunity. We could have changed the course of events had we used a little bit more imagination and had understood a little better the revolution that was taking place. There was an opportunity there. That opportunity has been missed, and things are now settling down into a groove which is much less pleasant. But I'm much less concerned about the return of communism, because communism as a dogma is well and truly dead. So I don't see communism coming back. What I see is regimes similar to communism, what I call closed societies, where the state dominates society, where a party dominates the state, where you have no rule of law, where you've got society mobilized somehow and you suppress freedoms, based more on ideology of nationalism, or national or ethnic identity. That is the real danger that you see all over.
Are those forces more powerful today than the forces for freedom and free markets and open markets?
Well, you see, it's a rather unequal battle. Because in order to have free markets, prosperity, etc., you need law and order, you need well-defined borders, you need security in order to invest. So as the situation becomes more insecure, you have a breakdown of law and order, you chase away capital, you can destroy economies. One of the best examples you have in Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia embarked on a program of reform exactly the same time as Poland, January 1, 1990. And I happened to visit in May 1990, at which time Yugoslavia was making much more progress than Poland. It had a better situation because it had better people running it, better trained, looked very good. And then Milosevic undermined the system by actually raiding the treasury at the time of the elections, upset monetary stability, and that was the end of reform in Yugoslavia. So
in the beginning of the end of the former Yugoslavia.
Well, that was it. And so it's only too easy to destroy and very difficult to build. So it's a very unequal struggle.
Why did we miss, just a moment on history, why did we miss the opportunity and the moment when it was ripe for the world, for the West, and certainly for the industrialized world, to respond to this dramatic change and the decline and end and death of communism?
I think that basically we somehow lost our moorings. It's not just a lack of leadership, but also lack of followership. In other words, our concept of freedom has changed over the years. You know, in the Second World War, we were fighting for freedom, not only for Americans, but for the world. And after the war, it carried over into the Marshall Plan, and out of which came the European Union. So we had some, let's say, ideals that we believed in. And those ideas have eroded. Instead of that, we now believe that everybody should just do the best for himself, and that will give you the best of all possible worlds. And it just isn't so. So I think that the dogma of geopolitics and laissez-faire have really incapacitated us from responding the right way.
Okay. Do you think, so what do you think and what do you want the Clinton administration to do at this point, whatever the missed opportunities are?
I would like to see them develop a concept about foreign policy. There is a lack of concept of what we stand for. And I think that we ought to stand for an open society, particularly in this part of the world, the former Soviet empire, because that system has collapsed. That is a new system is emerging, and what kind of system emerges, what form of government, will have a really great influence on the future course of history, and our security is really deeply involved.
Do you support the so-called Partnership for Peace to bring those countries within NATO?
I support the idea behind Partnership for Peace, but the way it came out is a sop. It's a empty gesture. I think that there ought to be, next to the Partnership for Peace, there ought to be also a Partnership for Prosperity, because the economic advance of those countries will have a tremendous effect on their political future as well. And that is where we lack the vision and the generosity, and it could be done. But it's really, let's say, a strange idea to bring up. It's so contrary to what people today believe.
Here's what's interesting to me. With all these extraordinary events happening, I mean, if you go back and look at those symbolic events, that the fall of the wall in Berlin, and all that happened, was there, whether the Bush administration flowing into the Clinton administration, was there vigorous debate about what we ought to do? Did at the top levels of the national government, did they consider in an intelligent way what our options were? Did they hear from your opinion and others and then simply fail to act because they were paralyzed, because they were distracted, because of some other reason? And even now, is there recognition of opportunity?
I don't think there is very much of that. I don't think there was any serious debate, but of course I don't know it, because right. there are people talking inside, and sure. maybe they considered everything. And I think that the real missed opportunity was at the time of the Bush administration, because revolutions are very unusual in the sense that what is possible at one moment sure. of time is not possible in the next moment. It's sort of a very radical change, and at the moment of revolution, practically anything is possible. Now later on, things kind of cool off. So the revolution sort of erupted in '89. It culminated in Russia in '91, and now we are already past the revolution, and now the pattern is pretty well set. It's in '89 that we ought to have acted differently.
Russia, are you optimistic, more optimistic, less optimistic when you look back from the last time that you and I talked, which was, I think, February?
Yes. Well, you see, what was so distressing in Russia, that you had a system disintegrating and no new system emerging. Well, that is changing, because there is now a new system taking shape. It's the mafia system. Right. I mean, there are now people with interests, and they know how to defend those interests.
And they control somewhat 25% of the economy.
Well, it's not really, the mafia is just a description for certain, let's say, private interests that is basically what it amounts to is the most successful privatization ever perpetrated, namely the privatization of public safety.
So people act out of fear of their life.
Well, because there is no public safety,
right.
or some public
Exactly.
safety has broken down, therefore people who are in a position, they protect themselves and they protect their interests, and you have enforcers, and they each have their territory and so on. So it is the beginning of a system.
Right,
now it's not attractive, but it is actually now it's robber capitalism, if you like.
Harking back to the late 1800s in the United States.
That's right. Similar. It's actually a combination, because the old guard, the Soviet system, was also a mafia system, really, because you had all these institutions sort of dividing up the pie among themselves.
Yes.
So it's a combination of the yes,
right.
it's a combination of the nomenclatura. The nomenclatura was just another name for mafia.
Are there still, turning to economics, are there still, if people with huge amounts of capital to invest come to you and say, I'm looking at Eastern Europe and I'm looking at Russia, do you encourage them, or does it simply depend on this very specifics of the investment interest?
Well, I have actually stayed out of investing in Eastern Europe, in the areas where I had foundations, for 5 years. I've now modified my stance, and I have started investing myself there.
In Russia or in Eastern Europe? Or both?
In Russia also, because there are some emerging large companies, the so-called blue chips, that if the capitalist system does take hold, those companies will be there, and so they could be interesting. And of course, since there's such a tremendous shortage of capital there, the prices are just incredibly low by our standards, but of course our standards don't apply.
But that would suggest that an enormous opportunity then.
There are enormous opportunities
to get
there.
in
I've deliberately abstained from them, because I didn't want to mix, let's say, the influence that I may have gained.
And your investment.
Yes.
Yeah, but the point I asked was not so much about you, but would you recommend to someone, knowing that you had that kind of restriction on your own investment? You seem to be saying, I have not lost my enthusiasm for the future of Eastern Europe in terms of its commercial potential.
Well, there are opportunities, and certainly some parts, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, are making the grade, and therefore are suitable areas for investment. Russia is extremely turbulent, and you take 100% risk when you invest there.
Tom Friedman, who writes for the New York Times, this is about global markets now, because we clearly know one thing, that people who invest the kind of money that you have under management have to think in terms of a global world that's interconnected from Tokyo to Zurich to London, and you maintain homes in New York and in London. Friedman, writing in the New York Times, said the answer is that it is increasingly Adam Smith's world, a world in which the balance of power between global financial markets and governments is tilting towards markets. When it comes to global markets these days, the motto of government is, there they go, I must catch up because I am their leader. Do you sense this, that global markets now are more influential than national governments?
I think there has been a decline in the power of national governments because of the increasing internationalization of financial markets. National governments which govern their territory can't really impose strict restrictions, because if they do, capital flows elsewhere, will avoid that market. And therefore any kind of regulation that has to be international. Now, in my opinion, financial markets do need regulation and supervision. They're inherently unstable.
Well, that's my point I want to get to, which is the notion of how are global markets accountable?
Well, there is now the beginnings of international regulation. The first major step was the Bank of International Settlement, BIS, standards that were established for banks. And they are valid for all the banks in all the countries, and they're the same standards, 6% of deposits, capital, etc. And because they're international, those are valid regulations. And there is now some talk about perhaps some of the derivatives markets or capital requirements for those who trade in derivatives. It's only if it's regulated internationally can it be effectively regulated.
But it's almost fair to say we have not yet seen institutions so powerful that they can do any kind of serious regulation, have we?
That is not so, because certainly in the banking industry, each bank regulator in its own country is quite powerful, right? And their power has been impaired by this mobility of capital, and they have responded to it by agreeing on some common standards of regulation. So regulation tends to lag behind the markets, but I think it's not at all impossible to have international.
So central banks should not say, watch out, here comes Soros, and what's he going to do, and how is he going to influence the value of our currency?
Well, they should be considered about what markets are going to do. So if Soros stands for markets, then of course they should worry about it.
Soros stands for influence on markets.
That's a different. You're shifting the ground, because as a market participant, I don't have influence on the market, because markets are very large, and my activities are really a tiny drop in the ocean. Maybe not a tiny drop, maybe it's a big drop. Yeah, but it's not by themselves. They have absolutely no capacity to move markets. There has been sort of some, let's say, have emerged as some kind of a mythical figure, a guru, and therefore people look to me for the markets sort of look to me for guidance, and so I now have potentially the ability to influence markets. I say potentially because once or twice I do it, I will lose it, because my understanding is not necessarily any better than the next fellow's.
Well, that's not true, but sometimes you win. When you win big, and when you lose big.
That's right. But so there is some kind of a myth around me. But what I'm saying is that I may now be able to influence markets by my predictions, and therefore I should not make predictions that will influence markets.
All right, let me just come to that, because you have said some very interesting things, and I wanted just to talk about you personally now, and as well as investments. You said in a piece, you said, I'm very comfortable with my public persona because it is one that I have created for myself. It represents what I've created for myself. It represents what I like to be, distinct from what I really am. You know, in my personal capacity, I'm not actually a selfless, philanthropic person. I'm very much a self-centered person.
Right.
Now, what did you mean?
Well, exactly what I said. I don't claim to be holier than thou, although under present circumstances I'm constrained to behave holier than thou, because I'm under such observation and scrutiny. But by nature, I'm no different from any other normal person.
How has all of this, I mean, asking you to define yourself, changed? I mean, what impact has it had on you?
But it has certainly had an impact. I must admit it. There's really been two major changes. One was in '89, when I deliberately sought to give publicity to my views, because I was hoping to influence Western reaction to the revolution
hoping to influence the things we were talking about at the beginning, and the notion of the debate that ought to be taking place about the future of Eastern Europe.
Right, and there I wrote a book, not this one.
The relativity.
No, it's Underwriting Democracy. Right. But I didn't get very much hearing for my views, I must confess, but I was seeking it. Not for my views on the market, but my political views. And I did, of course, have some influence in the countries concerned. Now, then came this other event, which was our role in the sterling crisis, and then I became suddenly a public figure.
Let me just stop because of the audience benefit. I mean, this was a place in which you bet and made $1 billion in terms of trading. It's said and trading on
but
the
because
pound.
it happened to be just a normal event, a normal course of activities. Because we took a position, let's say, of $10 billion. We have an equity of $10 billion, so it was not a leveraged position, which we normally have. We not use leverage, so it was just a normal position. It was of course unusual in the sense that there was a historic event, namely Britain left the European exchange rate mechanism as a result. But that was an event that would have occurred had we not taken the position. Had I never been born, that event would have occurred because the market was moving in that direction. I just happened to be a player in that market and a significant player. So that was the event that drew attention to me, right? But that changed my public persona because I emerged as this mysterious figure who can move markets, and that in some ways is a somewhat uncomfortable position to be in.
In what way? Why is it
because
uncomfortable?
there's a myth, and the myth does not correspond to the reality. I can't correct it, so I have to accept it. I have to live with it. It has its positive aspects and its negative aspects.
Positive aspects are that people listen to you.
The people listen to me. They only listen. They want to listen to me on exchange rates, but sometimes they have to put up with me when I preach about open society. And democracy.
Yes, right.
So that's a.
So you say if you listen to me on exchange rates, where I have for some reason been successful, you got to also look at my ideas, and I hope you'll view them with respect to open societies and why they are important.
That's right, but I also don't want to say anything about exchange rates because I think it would be destabilizing.
All right, but let me just have these points to make. Number one, you bet wrong on the yen. Yes.
Yeah. Well, so there was also a normal event.
Okay.
It happens.
You thought it was going down and it went up in relation to the dollar.
That's right. That's right. So it just shows. And I didn't deny it either, right, that it happened, because actually I wanted people to know that we are not always right.
You're not infallible.
That's right.
All right, now they say you are buying dollars.
Maybe, but you see, they also say that we are selling dollars. And fortunately, there are so many rumors about what we do that we have regained a certain degree of anonymity. Because all the rumors are in conflict. So
they cancel each other out.
That's right.
Are you buying dollars?
I don't know.
You don't know, or you don't choose to tell us?
I don't choose to tell you, and I may be buying or selling at this very minute without me knowing.
Do you believe in the dollar, and do you believe that the dollar in relationship to the yen ought to be over 100?
That's in view of what I just told you before. This is another question I'm going to answer.
Well, I thought I'd go at it from a different angle.
Right.
Do you believe in the health of the United States economy, and do you believe in the economics? The growth rate for the last quarter was 3.7, I think. Alan Greenspan said it's as good as he's seen it in 20 years. Yet there are also people look with some alarm at rising inflation and the corollary rising of interest rates.
Yes. I think that the economy actually is quite strong currently. There's considerable resilience. And I think you do have to worry about the potential for inflation. And if you allow the currency to depreciate too much, that can be very destabilizing because of its inflationary implications and its implications for the bond market.
I think that the president hasn't been given, this president, the credit he deserves, both in terms of public perception in the United States and perhaps overseas for the management of the economy. Do you think I'm wrong about that?
Yes, I think you're a little bit because, presidents don't really manage economies. I mean, the economies do well or badly, and then
Based on what?
and partly on the the rhythm of the economy.
Those global markets we were talking about.
That's right. That's right. And partly government policy, undoubtedly.
Well, that's what influences. So at least if they somehow influence government policy, don't they have an influence on national economies?
Yes. And I think that that Clinton came in and tried to limit the budget deficit, reduce the budget, and I think one should give him credit for that. Yes.
But that's about it from you.
Well, let's say they've made some mistakes in talking down the dollar against the yen.
Which they've acknowledged, I think, or at least
and they have corrected it.
Right.
They have corrected it. So I really find very little actually to criticize in the government policy. I just don't think that it's largely responsible for the current strength of the economy.
Yeah, okay. How do you think we are respected, we, the United States, today, for our leadership in the world because we are the remaining superpower? Are we respected around the world? Do they believe that most of the people you deal with, both because you are traveling around the world dealing with people at the, certainly at the prime minister level and dealing with the economic and finance ministers of major countries, how do we stand?
Not very well. Given our tremendous position as being the one remaining superpower, we really don't look very good. I mean, you look at these negotiations in connection with Bosnia. I mean, they really have the smell of Munich. Appeasement. I mean, and when you have
Is that just the United States or the failure of the United States to lead the rest of the world?
It's the failure of the United States to lead the rest of the world. Europe is actually in worse shape in this respect than America, and also America has a little bit more consistent policy than Europe has. It's really the failure, unfortunately, of open societies, of democracies. Munich was a failure of the democracies, and I think that Bosnia is a similar failure, and it will have very dire consequences. And when you
which are
instability. Because if there is no
consequence for action,
that's right. Then it's really an invitation for people to try to change borders by force, engage in ethnic cleansing, and all those things that if we don't stand up for certain. Stand up against certain kind of behavior, that behavior is going to spread, and it is spreading, and we are failing. And what's the point of being a superpower when let's say the murder and mutilation of one soldier on television screens can shift public opinion against being engaged?
You're talking about Somalia.
I'm talking about Somalia. Obviously, mistake was made in Somalia, a technical mistake.
Right.
But then not to intervene anywhere is again a mistake, as we now see to our horror in Rwanda. So the world is a very complicated place, and we don't know what our place in that world is.
That seems to say to me, though, to hear you talk about it that way, it's about wisdom and judgment and leadership.
That is correct. That is correct.
Those are hard things to come by.
Yes.
But clearly, late in coming to Rwanda, after 500,000 people were killed, same thing true in Bosnia.
Yes. And you see,
sure, it's much easier to me than it does from the White House, though.
Right, but you see, you could, if you have a conception and a certain standards, you can nip problems in the bud. I mean, I am particularly agitated on the issue of Macedonia. Now, nobody talks about it. It's a small country, it's really very largely forgotten. It's falling apart. It's, it is the main, let's say, victim of the embargo against Yugoslavia, and then the Greeks imposed an embargo from their side. So a landlocked country that has a railroad going north-south is now cut off both to the north and the south. And it's the last multi-ethnic country on the Balkans. It has a large Slavic population and a large Albanian population and Gypsies and Turks and Vlachs and others. So it's that's what. So it's a very mixed society. It can only survive as a country if it respects minorities, and it does have a government at the moment which really is a democratic government, a coalition of Slavic and Albanian.
It's threatened by the overflow of what might happen coming out of the experiences in the former Yugoslavia.
Yes, and of course it is threatened, and of course it is being destroyed by the embargo and by the inability of the United States and Europe to do anything about the Greek embargo, which is a flaunting of international rules, and nothing has been done about it for 2 years.
Do you have any confidence that the money that you have spent in terms of philanthropy, in terms of creating universities, in terms of, I mean, you just gave some more money to South Africa. You just recently spent some money, 25 million as I saw, maybe it's more, maybe less, I don't know. Do you have any sense that it's doing any good? That it's making a difference?
Yes, I have a very, very strong sense, and I only need to go and visit the foundations to be reinforced. At the same time,
seed money that has consequences beyond its even numbers.
I think that there are positive, real positive accomplishments. At the same time, let's say I gave $50 million for humanitarian aid to Bosnia. To some extent, it was a failure. I mean, the operation was successful. We established a water system for Sarajevo, etc., but the patient is still dying. So that money may well be lost because for circumstances which are beyond my control. But
about 30 seconds.
But I feel that at least I have tried. So I've done my share.
I thank you. It's always good to have you stop by. Please come by anytime. It's a pleasure to have you. George Soros. We now turn to a consideration of some of the difficult domestic issues that we face in this country, certainly including the economic future of the inner cities. Here is Hugh Price from the National Urban League.